All right, this is Learning Activity A, Government and History Basics. Please add 3 pieces of notes to the first part about history and the second part about government. You may just add 2. All right, so there are some basic things about history. Basically, history and the past are 2 things. Most of the time, people use them as interchangeable. But what we need to recognize is that history is actually a story or a narrative that people tell about the past. She made history with that speech isn't the same as she made this speech in the past. So the event that I typically give as an example to try to help you figure this out is me and my brother down in the basement. My brother and I are down in the basement. I decide when I'm young that I want a piece of candy. He will not give me a piece of candy, so I punch him. He goes upstairs and tells my dad that I choked him because my dad only cares if I choke my brother. He doesn't really mind if I punch him for some reason. So my dad needs to be convinced by Chris that I actually was choked, or I actually choked him. I told my father that my brother attacked me first. My dad has listened to 2 different versions of the past. So he's listened to 2 different narratives of the event. The event itself is the past, Chris's version, CJ's version, and then ultimately what Dad decides is the history of it. Those are all different stories, and none of them are just like the event. The past is not subjective. It did happen. There's no sort of interpretation about it. Anything that is interpreted is sort of the human element of it. Just like you can see this picture here with the watches, there are watches and they are real, but they have been interpreted by the artist to be sort of malleable and folding over and falling. The past, we just define the past as something that happens immediately after the present. You can't create it. You can't recreate it. You can't relive it. Time machines aren't real. The story about it is never like the event, just like the event. History itself, just like these 2 political cartoons here, are often different. You can see the past is the same. Ronald Reagan was the same president, but yet you have a person on the top that thought that Ronald Reagan was a really good guy, and the person on the bottom that didn't like Ronald Reagan so much. So they have different versions of the same past. All stories have bias. No matter how hard you try, you cannot eliminate bias. History can be created by anyone who has access to evidence, the primary sources. My father had primary sources when he looked at the welt on my brother's head, when he heard the stories of us, that people who were actually there. He had these primary sources to determine what he thought the narrative was. However, historians are people who are professionals who have been trained in a particular way, and who actually read each other's book and critically acclaim those particular books, or say these are good, these are bad. And something that you don't typically know is that there's actually a bunch of controversy about history. Since it is a story, since it is narrative, there's a ton of controversy. For example, who are the progressives? That's going to be a unit that we cover. The actual people who are the progressives are going to change based on who the author thinks that they are. So why do you even learn it? Well, you can understand our country's past and be able to appreciate American values. American values like working hard. You can understand that there's a Protestant moral behind that because of Protestants creating the massive amount of early Americans. Whether you like it or not, you're going to watch TV sometime and you're going to be able to see basic ideas that we teach about in class, and you're going to start understanding some of the events that are going on around the world and around our country. That will happen to you during this class at some point. You don't want to be a sucker. You can learn more powerful critical thinking skills, prevent you from being misled. You can question people when they tell you the versions of the story, and you can think about what bias that they may have or what reasons behind it. Not all the time is there bias like my brother and I's version of the story where we're trying to literally deceive my father, but a lot of times the bias is undetected and unknown by the author himself. You'll be able to appreciate places and people more completely without fearing differences if you understand it. The very first thing that leads to understanding, right, the very first step towards that is knowledge. Once you have knowledge of things, understanding will follow. And if all else fails and you have no other reason why you should work at this class, it's just this. You can't graduate without U.S. history. Graduation from high school equals more money for your future jobs. Unfortunately, without a high school diploma, getting a decent job is very difficult. This is the second part to 1.1 Learning Activity A, Government and U.S. History Basics. Please, on the second portion of this set of notes, add 2 extra things from the notes on each slide, as opposed to 3, like in the History Basics. We already went through this. Hopefully you've gotten that from the other video. Now, you're gonna need to understand some basic information about government. So here's some old information and some of it's new. The government has 3 branches, the legislative branch. Congress is the term that we use when we're talking about both houses together, the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House of Representatives is based on population. In the United States, there's 435 total. They're elected every 2 years. So California has 53, Iowa has 4. Wyoming, I believe, has 1. Okay, so what tends to happen is these group of people, or these representatives, tend to be more radical or more ideological than the Senate, their Senate counterparts. The Republicans tend to be more conservative, and the liberals tend to be more, the Democrats tend to be more liberal. In the Senate, where the age is 30 to get elected, as opposed to minimum age is 30 as opposed to 25 in the House, you only have 2 per state. You must be elected by the entire state. There's 100 members. They're elected every 6 years, so that means California and Iowa each have 2. These senators tend to be longer serving than the representatives, and they also tend to be less ideologically driven than the representatives do. Only Congress can propose and debate bills. Don't think that the president has the ability to do that. They can pass bills, they can kill bills, etc. I'd like to also point out that you must be able to pass a bill through the House and the Senate before it goes to the president. The president's role in passing bills is to actually physically sign it into law. That's it. Congress is the only part of the government that can declare war. In fact, the last time that the United States or Congress has declared war was after December 7th, 1941, when Pearl Harbor was attacked. All of those wars that we've had since, whether it's been Afghanistan or Persian Gulf or Vietnam, none of those have been officially declared war by Congress. Only Congress can impeach presidents and judges. Impeaching means bringing them to trial. It does not mean kicking them out. But Congress does have the ability to, if they're found guilty in their impeachment, to kick them out. The executive branch, okay, is the president and the rest of his administration. What people think is that the president is the only guy, which is interesting because the executive branch is actually the biggest of the branches. The military is involved, which makes it gigantic. But there's a lot of people that are needed in order to execute the laws that the country has. Also, another interesting thing is that the president is elected by electoral college, not by popular vote. Think of it in this way. Instead of seeing how many people in the United States want the president and determining who the president is by that, each state determines which presidential candidate that they want. And then once, for example, Iowa in 2012 elected Barack Obama. Barack Obama won the majority of votes in the state of Iowa. So the state of Iowa sent 6 electoral college votes to the electoral college. You need 270 to be president of the United States. The cabinet is the close number of people who advise the president. Each one of the cabinets are headed by the Secretary of. So the Department of Defense is headed by the Secretary of Defense. The Secretary of Transportation heads the Department of Transportation. The Secretary of State negotiates with foreign countries, and they have a staff called the Department of State. John Kerry is the current Secretary of State, and previously Hillary Clinton was. The powers of the executive branch is carrying out the laws passed by Congress, nominating members of the judicial branch, and the president is the commander-in-chief. The commander-in-chief simply means that they can control the military, which is, by the way, how we have gone to wars without actually being declared wars. The Congress has decided not to declare war, but they would give the president, the commander-in-chief, as much money as they needed for the war. The final branch is the judicial branch. Okay, and there's actually hundreds of small courts that handle most cases. There's a federal courthouse in Cedar Rapids, for example. Supreme Court is the most important court. There are 9 justices on the Supreme Court, nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate. They become judges for life. Okay, the biggest thing that the judicial branch or the Supreme Court does is interpret laws. Laws are really vague. The English language actually is pretty vague, so they decide how a particular situation fits the law. If, for example, there was a Linn-Mar High School Supreme Court, and they decided to review a case where somebody in Mr. McDonald's class was upset because the school rule, think about law, the school rule was that there were no hats in class. But Mr. McDonald interpreted that law as boys are not allowed to wear hats, but girls could. So they would take it to the Linn-Mar Supreme Court, and the Linn-Mar Supreme Court would then decide, does the way that Mr. McDonald interprets the law, is that constitutional or unconstitutional? Is the law itself, the rule about hats, is that okay or not okay? And that's sort of what the judicial branch does, but in a larger scale and for the country. They also can declare certain acts unconstitutional, and an example of a very famous Supreme Court is Brown versus the Board of Education. They actually overturned one of their own rulings in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson. Brown versus the Board of Education declared that segregated schools were unconstitutional. The judicial branch doesn't have a military or anything, however, to enforce that. So not until 1957 did the federal government or the executive branch actually enforce desegregation of schools. There's a system of checks and balances. You don't need to add anything to this slide. This system of checks and balances makes sure that no branch has more power than the others, or no branch can continually dominate the others. If you think of domestic, you think hopefully of other situations where you've heard the word domestic animals, domestic violence. These are things that belong in the house or are in the house. So if domestic policy, hopefully you can remember that it is laws that are within the country. Okay, raising and lowering taxes, enforcing voting laws, adding regulations to the economy, creating things like Obamacare, maybe even doing something like instilling a draft. Those are all domestic policies, things that affect our lives. Foreign policy affects our lives, but it also is directed at foreign countries. Mostly people think of war, but in reality, foreign policy is largely, the vast majority of it is economic. Trade agreements, cutting off trade with other countries. Like we have a trade embargo with Cuba that's been long-standing. We can't, your parents can't buy Cuban cigars or travel to Cuba. Now, federalism is a complicated term, but what it is it's a description of the type of government that the United States has. The United States has one big, giant federal government, and underneath it has 50 different state governments, because remember, there are 50 states, not 4, right? Each state then determines the different types of governments that are within it. So you and I, sitting at Linn-Mar High School, are ruled by the federal government, by the state of Iowa, by the Linn County government, by the Marion municipal government. Okay, so there are different rules in different states. As far as marijuana use, as far as gay marriage, as far as fireworks, as far as speed limits, as far as gambling ages. Each state has different rules about particular things. Same thing in cities, right? Currently in the city of Marion, you are not allowed to have a giant electrical LED billboard. In the city of Cedar Rapids, you can see plenty of them. So what happens is there's a complicated system of rules that we each fall under. So here we list out the different things that the federal government can do. Controls the military and foreign policy. Constitutionality of laws. The state governments are under jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. You can only have national money. You can't have, Iowa dollars. Even Iowa's quarters are just designed for Iowa. They're not actually quarters only from Iowa. They are U.S. quarters. Interstate commerce is the term that means any economic activity that goes from one state to the other. State powers are education. I am technically a state of Iowa employee.